Perhaps the very first sign had been far too subtle for an outsider to notice, too quiet, too deeply embedded in the nuances of family dynamics. When Matthew, once a tender and attentive son, started calling Evelyn by her first name instead of Mom, it wasn't just a shift in vocabulary. It was a fracture, a silent crack in a bond that had once felt unbreakable. Something inside her quietly broke. Evelyn Hamilton was 61 at the time, a woman carved out of resilience and unspoken strength. She had been widowed at the age of 43 and had raised her only son entirely on her own, without ever once asking for pity or applause. She worked tirelessly, splitting her days and energy between two jobs. One as a seamstress and the other as a house cleaner, just to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. Yet through it all, she managed to maintain her pride, carrying herself with a quiet dignity that rarely needed words. She didn't hold a university degree, but she had something far more enduring: a sharp memory, a mother's instinct, and a strength forged in solitude. Her late husband, Harold, had served as a military veteran and worked as a precision mechanic. Evelyn remembered him as a man who was equal parts meticulous and tender, someone who ensured every tool had its place, even when life itself seemed disordered. Together, they had built a modest, structured life, anchored in discipline and love. But in that particular year, the foundation of that life began to crumble, not from any outward catastrophe, but slowly, from within, like an old house that starts to crack in silence, its decay barely visible until it's too late. The arrival of Amanda into their lives marked the beginning of something that Evelyn couldn't name, not right away, but it settled into her like a chill, quiet, but deeply unsettling. Amanda was the type of woman who looked like she belonged on the glossy cover of a lifestyle magazine. Flawless features, practiced charm, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She had a talent for saying just enough, never too much, never too little, to leave a favorable impression. But behind every polished sentence, there lingered a subtle sting, a kind of verbal paper cut that hurt without bleeding. Her mother, Glenda, was even more refined in her contempt. She moved through rooms like she was walking a runway, wearing heels even when cooking, and articulating every phrase as if she were judging a contest she never intended others to win. Together, Amanda and Glenda shared a language of glances, of tight-lipped smiles, of barbed comments, cloaked in artificial sweetness. Evelyn noticed it first in the little things, the subtle ways they excluded her from conversations. The family gatherings that happened without her, the phone calls that stopped, and the dinners where she was placed quietly at the edge of the table, as if her presence was an afterthought. And Matthew, her son, the boy who once held her hand so tightly during storms, now seemed like a different man altogether. Suited, charming, and emotionally distant, he appeared enamored with this new version of his life, one where his mother had become an inconvenient shadow in the background. At first, Evelyn tried to dismiss the growing discomfort. She told herself repeatedly, almost like a prayer, that perhaps she was being overly sensitive, reading too much into Amanda's ways. After all, every person had their own manner, their own quirks. Maybe Amanda simply had a different approach to family, a more modern detachment that Evelyn wasn't used to. But then came the gestures, small, deliberate, and impossible to overlook. On her birthday, Amanda gifted her an anti-aging cream, exquisitely wrapped in a velvet-lined box, the kind usually reserved for expensive perfumes or heirloom jewelry. With a sugar-coated smile, she said, "We all want to stay young, don't we?" It was phrased as a joke, but the message pierced deeper than any insult. At Christmas, Evelyn received a beginner's cookbook, despite having spent decades preparing meals that brought people to tears with nostalgia. Dishes that had once held entire generations together at her table were now reduced to a condescending suggestion that she start from scratch. Each gift arrived as a polished dagger, attacks cloaked in politeness, jabs disguised as helpfulness. Evelyn didn't cry. She didn't argue or retaliate. She simply filed away each moment like a careful Archivist, not because she was bitter. Evelyn had never been the type to harbor grudges, but because something deep inside her, something sharpened by years of navigating hardship alone, whispered that none of this was coincidental. This wasn't social awkwardness, it was intentional, a slow erosion, a strategy. It was shortly after that when the physical symptoms began. They were small at first, easy to overlook, easy to rationalize. A brief moment of dizziness after sipping Amanda's special ginger tea. A flash of confusion, forgetting what she had entered a room for, turning on the stove, and forgetting to turn it off. Struggling to remember whether she had taken her medication that day or not. These weren't the usual signs of aging. Evelyn had always been meticulous, sharp, and organized, known for her precise memory and structured routine. But something had shifted. Matthew began to notice, though his reaction was far from concern. Instead, he echoed Amanda's casual remarks, always delivered like an afterthought. Maybe Mom needs a checkup, or she's been having a few lapses lately, don't you think? His voice was always calm, but his eyes had changed. They no longer looked at her with the trust and warmth of a devoted son. They scanned her, scrutinized her, as if hunting for signs of frailty. And Amanda, she continued her routine with unsettling calm. She brought Evelyn more natural remedies, mysterious capsules in unlabeled jars and teas that had strange, bitter aftertastes. Evelyn drank them, not because she trusted Amanda, but because she wasn't yet ready to raise the alarm. Not without proof, not without being certain. Evelyn, though quiet on the outside, began conducting a meticulous mental inventory, tracking events, sensations, and patterns with the same precision she once used to balance grocery lists with utility bills. It started subtly. She noticed that the dizziness and confusion almost always followed something Amanda had prepared with love, whether it was a warm nighttime tea infused with soothing herbs, herbal supplements in reused glass jars without a single instruction label, or a pitcher of supposedly detoxifying lemonade served at family lunches. One afternoon, as she was rinsing one of the specific mugs, Amanda insisted she use a cream-colored ceramic cup with a small chip on the rim. She noticed something unusual. The inside had a sticky residue, faint but unmistakable, like the aftermath of a dissolved pill. She didn't say a word. No accusations. No suspicion voiced aloud. But the next time she visited Matthew's home, she wrapped the napkin she had used to dry that chipped cup and sealed it carefully in a zippered bag, scribbling the date in pencil on the plastic. That napkin marked the beginning of what would later become her sanctuary, a notebook not filled with poetry or memories, but with cold, methodical entries. On the first page, she wrote, "Night tea, Dizinist cream cup. Chipped, napkin, preserved." It wasn't paranoia, it was documentation, it was survival. As the weeks progressed, the story being woven about Evelyn began to take root, not by her, but around her. Glenda, who had maintained an air of calculated politeness until then, began planting seeds of doubt in the ears of extended family members. Her tone was always performative, drenched in a faux compassion, perfected over years of passive aggression. "Have you noticed Evelyn repeats herself lately?" she asked at a baby shower, her voice tinged with concern. "She seems so tired these days, poor thing," she added with a rehearsed sigh. These weren't innocent observations, they were rehearsed narratives, the kind used to slowly erase someone's credibility. Matthew didn't contradict her. He no longer defended his mother with the loyalty of the little boy who once clung to her hand at the dentist's office. Now, he merely shrugged, complicit in his silence. At a casual Sunday barbecue, Amanda floated a suggestion casually, as if it had just occurred to her that perhaps Evelyn should consider giving up driving for safety. The phrase hovered in the air like smoke from the grill, faint and toxic. That very night, Evelyn sat at her kitchen table and pulled out an old-school notebook, hard blue cover, a leftover from Matthew's childhood. She began to write. With clinical detail, she recorded what was said, what was served, how she felt, and when. Her words would become her shield. If no one believed her voice, they would believe the facts. The more Evelyn wrote, the clearer the picture became, not just a suspicion, but a structured timeline of decline, one that aligned disturbingly well with Amanda's increasingly generous care. Everything followed a chilling rhythm. Amanda was always the one preparing the meals, the drinks, the little health boosts no one else asked for. Evelyn, driven by instinct and a quiet kind of desperation, began staging her own small experiment. She stopped consuming everything Amanda offered, at least not fully. When no one was looking, she would pour the remainder of a strange-tasting tea into small glass vials and hide them inside her sewing kit, nestled beneath spools of thread and old buttons. She labeled each one with masking tape and a ballpoint pen. Sunday, severe headache; Thursday, foggy memory; Friday, dizzy spell. Week after week, her notebook thickened with pages filled in fine, slanted handwriting. She also began to scan those pages, particularly the ones written on days she felt altered, comparing the tremble in her pen strokes. Even her handwriting, once confident and upright, betrayed the days she had been drugged. Evelyn wasn't a doctor, but she was a mother and a woman who had learned to survive in silence. Her methods weren't scientific, but they were precise. She wasn't just documenting symptoms, she was building a case. Then, one quiet afternoon, the veil of speculation lifted. Evelyn had gone to Matthew's house and was seated in the back patio, pretending to admire the garden while Amanda and Glenda chatted in the kitchen. They believed she was too far away to hear, or perhaps, and this thought chilled her more, they assumed her mind was already too clouded to process anything. But Evelyn heard, clear as day. She heard Glenda mention the possibility of initiating a legal guardianship, citing Evelyn's supposed cognitive decline as justification. She heard Amanda respond without hesitation, even suggesting they contact a family lawyer she knew. Words like "take over the estate," "ensure stability," and "she won't even notice" cut through the breeze like shards of glass. Evelyn sat perfectly still, her fingers curled tightly into her palms, her nails digging into the skin to keep herself grounded. They weren't just ignoring her, they weren't just mocking her. They were plotting to erase her, to strip away what Harold had left behind for her and reduce her to a dependent, silenced presence. Later, when Matthew appeared with 2 glasses of wine and offered one to his mother with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, Evelyn accepted it. She smiled too sweetly, falsely. She let the bitterness coat her tongue. That moment, that taste, would never leave her memory. From that day forward, Evelyn stopped playing the passive role they had scripted for her. She shifted from silent resistance to calculated performance, but it was all on her terms. Now, she embraced their expectations like a costume. Feigned confusion, delayed reactions, clumsy movements. She would sometimes walk into the kitchen and stare at the refrigerator as if she had forgotten why she was there. Other times, she asked where her glasses were while they rested on top of her head. She staged the kind of forgetfulness that would validate Amanda's narrative, and they took the bait. Amanda and Glenda began to relax. They whispered less and spoke more freely, emboldened by what they believed was Evelyn's steady decline. Evelyn played her role with chilling precision, becoming the very caricature they had been painting. The forgetful, fragile, older woman slowly slipping into irrelevance, but behind her gentle eyes and slow movements, her mind was sharper than ever. Every word, every shift in tone, every offhand remark was being recorded. She had sewn a tiny audio recorder into the lining of her handbag, the same bag she carried to every dinner, every visit. In the quiet of her home, she would transcribe the recordings with timestamps and details, copying them meticulously into her notebook, line by line. Eventually, her strategy began to pay off. One evening, while reviewing the latest audio files, Evelyn paused when she heard Amanda's voice, low, careless, and loaded with entitlement. "We're almost there," she muttered. "Just one more little slip and she's finished." Evelyn rewound the recording, listening 5 times to ensure she had captured every syllable. It was the confirmation she had needed, not just of malice, but of premeditation. That very night, she devised a plan of her own. She prepared a tea, placed a valerian capsule into the cup, just as Amanda might have done, and left it sitting untouched on the coffee table beside her as she lay curled on the couch, feigning sleep. The next morning, when Matthew stopped by, Evelyn calmly gestured to the untouched mug. "Have you ever wondered," she asked, her voice quiet but direct, "why I always feel worse after people take care of me?" The question hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. Matthew didn't answer. He stared at her with that same blank, distant gaze, a man caught between suspicion and denial. And in that moment, Evelyn understood something that hurt more than betrayal itself. Her son wasn't innocent. He simply lacked the courage to stand on the right side of the truth. The turning point came cloaked in politeness, a formal invitation to what Amanda called a family dinner hosted at Matthew's house. The message had been carefully worded, cordial, but unmistakably orchestrated. When Evelyn arrived that evening, everything was set with unnerving precision. A pristine linen tablecloth draped over the dining table, candles flickering softly, and porcelain plates that hadn't seen daylight in years. It was the kind of meticulous staging that didn't signal hospitality, it screamed performance. Amanda greeted her with exaggerated warmth and handed her a glass of a fruitan d'herbe concoction, claiming it was perfect for unwinding after a long day. Evelyn accepted it with a practiced smile, eyes soft, movements slow. What Amanda didn't see, what no one saw, was the small leather notebook hidden inside Evelyn's handbag. The very notebook that had, for months, held her reality together page by page. When Amanda got up to fetch something from the kitchen, Evelyn calmly reached across the table and switched her glass with the one resting by Glenda's plate. No one noticed. No one, that is, except Evelyn and her unwavering memory. The first 20 minutes unfolded like theater. There was idle conversation, overly enthusiastic smiles, and veiled commentary about aging gracefully and taking better care of ourselves as we get older. Evelyn nodded politely, participating without truly engaging. Across the table, Glenda sipped her drink with her usual air of superiority, blissfully unaware of what was quietly unraveling inside her. Amanda kept sneaking glances at Evelyn, waiting, hoping for signs of confusion or imbalance. She watched like a hawk, expecting her mother-in-law to lose her train of thought, slur her speech, or fumble her utensils. But Evelyn remained poised. Her eyes were clear, her posture steady. Then, around the 35-minute mark, something shifted. Glenda furrowed her brow. She touched her forehead, blinked rapidly, and asked, visibly dazed, whether anyone else was feeling warm. She tried to rise, but stumbled, her balance faltering. Amanda shot up from her chair in alarm, while Matthew looked on, dazed and disoriented by the sudden change in energy. And then Evelyn spoke, not shakily, not with hesitation, but with the calm, measured authority of someone who had waited patiently for her moment. "I haven't had a single sip tonight," she said clearly, "but I can tell you exactly what's in that glass." What followed was a silence so heavy it seemed to press down on the room like a physical weight. For a few seconds, no one breathed. Amanda turned a sickly shade of pale, her carefully composed expression cracking under the pressure. Glenda, now visibly struggling to stay upright in her chair, began to mutter incoherent phrases as her hands trembled against the table. Her elegant poise dissolved, revealing the panic underneath. Matthew, confused and alarmed, kept asking what was going on, his voice rising slightly, his gaze darting between his mother, his wife, and the woman who had once raised him alone. But Evelyn didn't falter. She no longer spoke in whispers or hesitations. With calm precision, she reached into her purse and pulled out the worn blue notebook, the same one that had borne witness to her silent suffering. She placed it on the table, right next to the glass that was still moist from Glenda's last sip. "In here," she said, her voice unwavering, "you'll find every date, every symptom, every name of every tea and capsule you ever gave me. Every single dose, every single time." Then she turned her gaze to Matthew, not with anger, but with the quiet ache of someone who had waited too long to be believed. "And you," she said, barely louder than a whisper, "you saw it all." The words landed like thunder in the stillness. No one moved. Amanda's breathing grew erratic, her mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came. She was caught between instinct and guilt, paralyzed by the reality that had finally caught up to her. Matthew looked down, the weight of shame evident in his slumped shoulders. For the first time, Evelyn saw the truth clearly. It wasn't that he didn't know, it was that knowing had been too inconvenient. Too much of a disruption to the life he had built. But now the truth was no longer hidden. It was sitting on the table, undeniable and documented, and there would be no more silence. It was Matthew who finally broke the paralysis. His hands trembling, he pulled out his phone and called emergency services. His voice shaky as he reported that his mother-in-law had suddenly fallen ill and that immediate assistance was needed. He didn't explain the full story. How could he? But his tone was urgent, almost desperate. When he hung up, Evelyn was already standing. Her handbag was slung neatly over her arm, her expression calm, composed, and strangely lighter than it had been in months. She didn't shout, she didn't gloat. There were no dramatic declarations, only one final sentence, quiet, resolute, and impossible to forget. "You can keep the dishes, the house, the silence. I'll keep the truth." Then she turned and walked to the door with the grace of someone who had nothing left to prove. The ambulance arrived swiftly, its lights casting flickers of red and white against the pristine walls of Matthew's carefully curated home. As paramedics rushed inside and began attending to Glenda, Evelyn stood just outside the house, under the dim glow of a street lamp, watching with a stillness that made her almost invisible. One of the paramedics noticed her and asked gently, "Are you all right, ma'am?" Evelyn gave a slight nod. She didn't speak, she didn't need to, because that night she hadn't simply exposed a scheme or saved herself from being erased. She had dismantled an entire fabrication, one that had been built carefully, brick by brick, on her perceived fragility. And she had done it with quiet conviction, armed not with vengeance, but with clarity and patience. It wasn't a victory. She would celebrate, but it was the kind of triumph that leaves no doubt Evelyn had reclaimed her story. The toxicology reports arrived sooner than expected. Not that Evelyn had been waiting by the phone. She knew, deep in her bones, what they would reveal. Still, when the officers came to Amanda's home the next morning with a search warrant, it brought a strange kind of vindication. They moved through the kitchen like investigators at a crime scene, collecting jars of capsules, half-used tea, blends, and suspiciously unlabeled containers that Amanda had once praised as herbal miracles. Evelyn had already handed over her meticulously labeled bags, the ones she had filled with remnants of strange drinks, annotated with dates and symptoms in that familiar, slanted handwriting. Her notebook was submitted as evidence to one officer. Flipping through the pages with growing astonishment, remarked that if the presence of benzodiazepines was confirmed, the charges could be serious. Evelyn only nodded. She didn't ask questions. She didn't break down. She had already mourned not just for herself, but for the mother she had once been, and the son who had let go of her hand. The days that followed were marked by a heavy stillness, as if the house she had once built her life around had finally gone quiet. Matthew never called. Amanda remained silent as well. But on the fifth day, as the sea breeze drifted through Evelyn's new windows, there was a knock at the door. Uniformed officer handed her a sealed envelope. Inside was a copy of the toxicology report. Confirmed. The liquid samples she had collected over the months contained sedatives in dangerously high concentrations. Several of the capsules, labeled as natural supplements, also tested positive for controlled substances. It was official now. Her memory hadn't failed her. She hadn't imagined it. They had drugged her. Silently, methodically, and with the intent to take everything. She stood at her window holding the letter, staring into the wind, not with relief, but with a quiet grief. Not because justice had come, but because it had come too late to matter in the way it once would have. The news spread quickly, as such things always do, seeping into the corners of the social circles that Evelyn had once been a reluctant part of. Old acquaintances exchanged glances at the market. Whispers floated through hair salons and garden clubs. Some pretended to be shocked, raising their eyebrows, and offering empty expressions of sympathy. Others claimed they had always sensed something strange about Amanda, conveniently retrofitting their hindsight. But Evelyn wasn't interested in their belated opinions. She wasn't seeking vindication from neighbors or the illusion of communal support. What she wanted, all she had ever wanted, was to reclaim her own story, to hold the pen once again and write the truth in her own hand. When Amanda was called in for questioning, her initial poise crumbled under pressure. She admitted, partially, that she had been giving Evelyn sedatives without a prescription. She claimed it had been for Evelyn's own good, a way to help her rest more. A lie wrapped in care. A poison delivered with a smile. Glenda, still hospitalized and visibly shaken by her own reaction to the drink that night, denied any involvement. But the evidence, the swapped glass, the recorded conversations, the presence of her fingerprints on multiple containers, told a different story. As for Matthew, he distanced himself entirely. He told the authorities that he had never noticed anything unusual, that he had simply assumed his mother was aging. When questioned directly, he claimed ignorance, not out of innocence, but out of fear. And when he eventually came to Evelyn's door, his eyes red from tears and fatigue, he didn't arrive to apologize. He arrived to explain, to rationalize. Evelyn listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't offer forgiveness or fury. She simply turned to a nearby shelf, picked up a photo of him as a baby, the one she had cherished for decades, and slowly turned it face down. She didn't smash the frame, she didn't burn the memory, she just removed it from view. Because sometimes, the greatest heartbreak isn't betrayal, it's realizing the person you sacrificed everything for no longer recognizes your worth. The days that followed felt like echoes, quiet, weighty, and filled with the residue of everything Evelyn had endured. She moved through her home like someone preparing to leave a place where love had once lived, but now only memories remained. There was no rush, no frenzy, just intention. She folded linens with care, gave away furniture that had outlived its comfort, and donated clothes that no longer belonged to the person she had become. She ripped up old letters, not out of anger, but as an act of cleansing. There was no farewell posted on the door, no speech to mark her departure. Evelyn only wrote one letter, and it wasn't meant for apology or revenge. It was handwritten slowly, in deliberate, strong strokes, addressed to her granddaughter. She sealed it, placed it inside a weathered box, and locked it in a safe with one final instruction. Open only after my passing. Inside, there was no bitterness, only truth, layered, painful, and clear. She recounted who each person had been, what they had done, and why she had chosen to walk away instead of fight a war where no one had ever truly stood beside her. Her departure wasn't a retreat, it was a liberation. Evelyn relocated to a small house by the sea, tucked away on a quiet stretch of coast where the horizon seemed to breathe with her. The ocean, with its rhythmic tides and ever-changing sky, offered something she hadn't felt in years. Peace without suspicion. She planted herbs in the garden, lavender and rosemary among them, their fragrance rising like prayers from the soil. She adopted an old dog, one that had been left behind by someone else, much like she had once been, and named him Harold, after the man who had loved her without conditions. Slowly, she stitched a new life from remnants. She began teaching sewing classes at a local community center. sharing not only skills, but a calming presence that others quickly came to treasure. She revised her will, removing Matthew and Amanda entirely. In their place, she created a protected fund for her granddaughter and donated part of her estate to veteran shelters and mechanical restoration programs, the kind her late husband would have been proud of. It was not an act of spite, but one of clarity. Evelyn was no longer trying to be remembered. She was simply choosing who she wanted to be from that point forward.